So for our next segment, we're starting a bit of a new format for some parts of our show. Nathan and I have a fair amount of expertise in our respective areas, but we're not always able to show it off, and we're not always able to, talk about subjects that we cover, partly because we're professionals.
Yeah.
And so we're doing special segments where one of us is the novice and one of us is the expert. For this one, we're referring to Professor Nathan. Now, Professor Nathan, would you prefer to go by Professor Sealove or Nathan or Professor Nathan?
I'm going to tell you what I tell my students every single time on the first day of class. My name is Nathan Sealove. It is okay to just call me Nathan, but I understand that you all have been raised in the neoliberal hierarchy that is America. And that hierarchy has taught you to refer to those standing in the front of the room by titles such as Professor or Mister. So if, because of that upbringing, you so choose to refer to me as Professor Sealove or Mr. Sealove, or if you want to compromise and make it Professor Nathan, you may do so. But it is totally okay to just call me Nathan.
Okay.
I actually say that.
I love
that.
I love that. Okay, well, I'm going to call you Professor Nathan because at this point you're standing in the front of the room, and I'm going to ask you some questions about the topic. So today we're talking about objectivity in the media. So to start off, what does it mean for the media to be objective?
Well, so let's first look at the definition of objectivity. So the definition of objectivity from the Oxford English Dictionary is the fact of not being influenced by personal feelings or opinions, but considering only facts. So as it stands, and I'm going to kind of steel man the argument for the media side. As it stands, the idea is that the media should just be calling balls and strikes, right? That there are objective realities that exist within politics, that exist within political information. And it's the media's job to disseminate those objective facts to their audience without any personal feelings, without any opinions, without any further analysis, without additional context, because additional context and additional analysis drips into opinion territory.
I feel like that seems like kind of a good thing, right?
Yep.
Isn't like objectively reflecting the facts kind of inherently good?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Michael, because I'm going to make a bold claim that I actually do hope that when everybody hears this, and you included, when you hear this, that you're immediately skeptical about it, because you should be, because this is a bold claim. So people are always talking about how the biggest problem within media is the lack of objectivity, namely all of the partisan bias that exists in the media, which constricts the view of the media into these narrow focuses where they're regurgitating partisan talking points and thus misinforming the public.
I feel like I would fall into that camp.
Here is the argument that I'm going to make. Partisan bias in the media is probably the least detrimental and least interesting type of bias that exists in the media. And in fact, the push for objectivity does way more damage than partisan bias ever has and ever will. There's my bold claim.
Oh my God. I just want the audience to know that I am also hearing this claim for the first time, because what we're doing for these segments is no preview discussions. So
Yes.
call me fucking skeptical. Oh man, I don't know how you're gonna pull this one through.
I'll defend it.
Okay. So
And I would just like to be clear.
yeah.
I'm specifying the push for objectivity, not
Okay.
objectivity itself, the push for objectivity.
Okay, so I think that leads right into another question I had. Okay, so I feel like objectivity in the media is driven by journalists. Like, if I think about like the typical, like archetypical journalist type, it's like someone wanting to find out the truth, kick butt, speak truth to power, all that stuff. And I'm not sure how a push by journalists for objectivity would be a problem.
Well, I would just like to point something out. You're talking about speaking truth to power, but
Yeah.
speaking truth to power by necessity requires further analysis and, to some extent, a level of opinion.
Interesting.
So the push for objectivity often does just lead to a regurgitation of the standard line from the government. So let me give you an example. And I believe that we actually talked about this example on the pod when it happened. Remember during the Afghanistan pullout, there was a drone strike that was committed against someone who the government claimed was an ISIS terrorist cell. All right, it was this guy who was driving through Kabul, and this surveillance drone was seeing that he was loading stuff into his car, and he was driving to suspicious places that they thought was an ISIS safe house. And then, as he was pulling into his house, the drone decided to launch a bomb at him, and it killed him. Now, the initial line from the government was that there was a terrifying terrorist who was about to do terrorism, and we stopped him, so yay us. The media basically regurgitated that, and to some extent, in some cases, took it a little bit farther, because the initial line was that the only people that died were the intended targets. And then it was revealed that there were 10 people that died, including children. So 10 family members, including 7 children, were killed in the strike. And the government didn't acknowledge that. But what the government did say eventually was that they believed that there was a bomb inside the car that created a secondary explosion. Therefore, the children were not killed by the bomb launched by the drone. They were killed by a secondary explosion. And that was the official line that was regurgitated by the media. And it wasn't until about a week later that the New York Times did a really great in-depth investigative piece where they actually sent over experts to look around to question the government line, to disagree with what the government was saying, and actually find the truth. Now, the reason why the initial article was reported the way that it was is because when it comes to the media, disagreeing with officials leads to accusations of bias.
Interesting.
And it infringes on their ability to seem objective. So the New York Times went out of their way to try to look deeper and to prove them wrong. But other organizations, for the sake of objectivity, reported the news as so-and-so Pentagon official said. And it is an objective fact that so-and-so Pentagon official said that, but what they said was not true.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so if I'm understanding this correctly, if all of them were being truly objective, that would mean like one thing, but it would also have to be really effective. It would also have to include other stuff like analysis, investigation, all that extra stuff. But the problem is that they want to seem objective more and be truly objective, but not thorough, more than they want to be accurate. And so to your point, the ability for them to report on what people say so that they can be objective, like to the letter, but not to like the truth, enables them to seem objective and claim objectivity without actually having to bear the responsibility of finding the truth.
Yeah, and I love how you distinguish between facts and truth right there, because there is an important difference.
Yeah.
All right. It is a fact that that Pentagon officials said that this was an ISIS person. Turns out they were a fucking aid worker.
Sure.
And what they were loading into their car was not bombs, it was water.
So the water caused a secondary explosion that killed the family.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is the New York Times even sent an explosives expert to look at the shockwaves, and they only found evidence of one shockwave, which meant one explosion.
Oh my gosh.
And so the point is, it is a fact that a Pentagon official said that this was an ISIS cell. This was an ISIS person. But it is not truth, because it is not true that this person was an ISIS person.
Interesting.
And the focus on facts over truth, because truth can lead to accusations of bias, ends up preventing them from actually reporting in-depth analysis. And it leads to another thing another very common practice in the media that's referred to as fragmentation.
Okay.
So, fragmentation is basically when the media takes some type of story or event and reports it as its own isolated incident, its own separate thing that happened. The problem is you're not giving context.
Sure.
So
It's almost like nothing in the world happened in isolation for the first time by itself, except like the Big Bang.
yeah, exactly. So because, again, the push for objectivity prevents the media from further analysis, because analysis can potentially be be called out for bias. What the media does is they create a formula where they just show you, they have an article that says the who, the what, the where, the when, and the why. They put that in an article. They don't contextualize it, and then they put that out there, which means that you might know, a story of Joe Biden met with Saudi Arabia Crown Prince bin Salman in the White House to discuss international relations. But you know nothing from that.
Yeah.
All right?
Yeah.
You know nothing from that. Maybe they would even throw in to discuss Yemen specifically. All right? Without the further context of, number one, the genocide in Yemen, number two, the constant weapons deals that we keep giving to Saudi Arabia. Without that further context, you would look at that and think, well, nothing to see here.
Yeah.
But if you gave that context, again, you're going to be accused of not being objective.
I'm like getting like chills because I'm like thinking about this stuff. So you're like sparking so many thoughts in my head. So this is so interesting. Basically, in order for them to like seem objective, to keep their articles short, to like do the news journalism formula, they are offloading the responsibility of context and information, basically for their articles to be informed, to their reader. As a reader, you have to go look up, why the fuck are they talking about Yemen? So in order for them to like have like their formula and their factual facial objectivity, right? They're like, it's true on its prima facie, right? It's true on its face. They don't go into all of the context, all the information you will need in order to digest and interpret this information, which this is so interesting because it's like inherent in, it seems like inherent in like news as a business formula, news as a model, because it's like, what do we need? We need to seem objective so that people will read us, which means we need to be able to always claim that the things we have claimed are true. Boom. That's your first formula. Pentagon official said X. And then second formula, what do we need? We need to keep people's attention. We need to keep it short and we need to stick to the facts. Therefore, cut out context. And like that.
Yep.
And the other thing is, as I'm reflecting on the way I read news articles, there are some organizations out there that regularly put in a ton of context into their articles.
Yes.
The Atlantic,
Yes.
Salon, the New Republic.
ProPublica.
ProPublica. As a consumer of news, I approach those articles more skeptically. I will read those articles and trust them less because I'm used to someone basically writing down the bullet points. I love Axiom's articles because they are fact, done. But to your point, that's a defect, not a bug or not a feature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And here's the other thing. And this is something that I'm sure most people have noticed, but they probably haven't thought about too much. Have you ever noticed that if you read one article about a specific event, you've probably read them all?
Yeah. Oh my God.
Because they mostly just say the same thing.
Dude, yes. With this DeSantis thing, I was like trying to find other articles about the diversity, equity, and inclusion thing. And it was 30 articles that had the same headline.
Exactly. That is the point. Once they have that formula of who, what, where, when, why, as their standard operating procedure, if you read one article, you've read it all. because they're not being analytical about it. They're just saying, here are the facts. And, perhaps here are the things that we objectively know are facts. Maybe that's a good thing. But as we know, facts without context can be just as detrimental as straight up lies.
Yeah.
Statistics without context, without explanation, without analysis, can be just as detrimental as straight up lies.
There's a reason why we read the methodology portions of the studies when we talk about them, because like shitty studies which have facts in them that are true can be just as detrimental as fake, information. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about like objectivity and like tied it to like media today and like the push for short form accuracy, blah blah blah, all that stuff. But like it didn't always have to be this way, right? Like how did we get here? What's the history that led us to like this push for objectivity and expectation like that?
The short answer is capitalism.
Damn it.
Here,
that's just fill in the blank.
Here's the long answer. So a lot of people might assume that objective journalism arose because of some type of inner moral imperative of a bunch of companies that thought, I want to make sure that the world knows how star-spangled awesome I am. So I'm going to create these standards that everybody needs to follow so that, to uphold the highest form of professionalism or morality or whatever.
The fourth estate. We've endowed it with like a special name.
Yeah. So here's why that's bullshit. So in the early days of the United States, partisan newspapers were actually very common. In fact, they were necessary for political parties because there was actually a very firmly established unwritten rule that politicians were not supposed to directly campaign to people.
Interesting.
All right? They weren't supposed to do that. Instead, the mouthpiece of political parties was supposed to be the newspapers that they helped fund. Okay. And Thomas Jefferson actually believed he actually thought that was a good thing. And that's one of the reasons why freedom of the press was so important as part of the First Amendment. Because what Thomas Jefferson believed was that if you have a bunch of newspapers that are argumentative in nature, that go out to the publics, that the public will be exposed to as many different points of view as possible and come at it with an informed idea.
Sunlight's the best disinfectant kind of thing.
And furthermore, it requires a set of skills. You can report what happened objectively, but if you argue it, if you make a good argument, if you go through the in-depth analysis of a political event, you explain it, you contextualize it, and you argue it, that requires a completely different set of skills and a very valuable set of skills. Basically, the ability to argue for your point of view as a newspaper was a valuable set of skills that political parties took advantage of. However, that started to change when politicians, specifically presidential candidates after the Andrew Jackson era, started to take their cases directly to the people. And what happened was that the funding for those papers, which at the time was mostly a bunch of local papers, started to dry up. And in order to stay in business, newspapers had to find another funding source. And they found it in advertisement. And the issue is, advertisement, whereas political party funding doesn't really depend on sales as much because you're being funded by an institution. Yeah,
institutions that are interested in getting information and point of view out there as a good in itself.
Yeah. But when it's advertisement, when advertising is your business model, it's less about getting information out there and more about providing a product in the cheapest possible way and selling it to as many people as possible. And there were a lot of factors that ended up contributing to this. There were factors of, inventions such as the telegraph that was able to get information to multiple different places around the country. There was eventually, of course, the invention of the telephone. There was the invention of transportation that allowed for centralized information to be distributed wider to the country. You know, the creation of the Associated Press in 1848, where there was a centralized information network that needed a way to transport their message to the largest number of people possible. And here's the thing. When you're partisan, the people that you're often targeting are a niche audience.
Yeah.
But when you are politically neutral, you appeal to a wider audience. And because these newspapers depended on advertisers for their funding, they also had to depend on newspaper sales in order to stay in business.
Yep.
And if you want to maximize the number of newspapers that are being sold, you have to make sure that they appeal to the widest audience. And that was the start of objective journalism. It had nothing to do with, you know, a specific set of journalistic standards, and it had everything to do with appealing to the widest possible crowd. That's how it started. And as journalism started to expand and become more centralized, because again, in the early days of the Republic, it was more localized. As it became more centralized, it started to become more of a profession, which meant that the standards that, by the way, they had done initially out of necessity started to become part of their practice. And it allowed them, as they expanded more, it allowed them to create it as more of a profession, so allowing it to be taught in universities and colleges. And again, when they were taught at that university level, they were teaching them the same skills, the same standards that they had been using in order to make the to make journalism what it was, which again meant neutrality and objectivity. The rhetoric of objectivity started to originate more in the 1920s, when you had tabloids, which were often more utilized by by poor working class people, and your so-called objective newspapers that were more focused on, here are the specific facts of the situation. And it was actually considered a status thing to have those types of papers. So marketing them as objective was a huge part of trying to appeal to this intellectual elite and financial elite that started to be created in the 1920s. So, to recap, the idea of objectivity was purely made to make it easier to print the stories, because as we talked about earlier, it is very easy to just write a story that's the who, the what, the where, the when, and the why, than it is to actually spend time analyzing it and contextualizing it. And the reason why we have those objective standards is not because of ethics, it's not because of morality, it is purely because that is what helped them sell more papers to a wider audience.